Cold Springs, Wyoming Territory, 1887. There was a horse at Cold Springs that no one could touch, and a boy who could not stop trying. And between the two of them, they had worn out the patience of every driver on the Sweetwater line. The horse was a blue roan gelding, 4 years old, and made of pure objection. He had come off a Mustang drive 2 springs back, one of a dozen the stage company rounded up out of the Red Desert, and found, on closer acquaintance, that they did not want. 11 of the 12 had gentled down to harness by August. The 12th had put 2 men in the dirt, bitten a third, and jumped a 5-rail fence from a standstill, which the company superintendent said was less a horse than an argument with legs. He told Della to sell it for whatever the tannery would give. Then Della's boy stood at the corral rail and looked at that blue roan the way other children looked at Christmas. And the superintendent, who had a soft spot he tried to keep hidden, signed the unwanted horse over to Cold Springs for $1 silver, and told Della it was her funeral. So the horse stayed. It ate hay Della could not spare, and gentled not 1 inch. And every evening after the last stage rolled out for South Pass, 8-year-old Eli Rourke climbed the rail and talked to it, low and steady, in the tone he had once heard his father use on horses, back when he still had a father to watch. Blue never came closer, but he never left either, and at Cold Springs that counted for something. Emmett Shaw came up the road on foot the 2nd week of June, leading a bay gelding that had gone lame 12 miles back, and the first thing he saw at Cold Springs was the boy on the rail and the blue roan in the pen, the two of them regarding each other across 6 feet of dust like a pair of nations that had not yet declared war. He might have walked on. A man on foot leading a lame horse has business of his own and no call to borrow anybody's. But Blue threw his head just then and shied hard off the far rail, and the boy flinched, and Emmett stopped without deciding to. "He won't hurt you from there," Emmett said. "He minds folks closing in." The boy looked at him, small for 8, brown from the sun, with a cowlick no water had ever defeated, and his mother's straight, measuring stare. "Nobody can get near him," Eli said. "He doesn't let anybody." "No," Emmett agreed, not looking at the horse straight on. "I don't expect he would, from how folks have likely been going at him." He set down his lead and stood at the rail a little apart from the boy, and after a while Blue stopped shying and stood watching him instead, ears pricked, deeply suspicious. Emmett did nothing at all. He just stood there, unhurried, as though he had come a long way to do exactly this much and no more. "Are you the new driver?" the boy asked. "No." "Are you leaving?" There it was, the question the boy asked everyone. The drivers and the hostlers and the drummers and the freight men. Everyone who came up the Sweetwater Road and stayed long enough to be asked. Emmett would learn later that Eli asked it the way you test a floorboard before you trust it with your weight. "Everybody leaves," Eli said, before Emmett could answer, saying it flat and certain, the tone a boy uses for a hurt he has decided not to feel anymore. "The drivers leave. My pa's gone." He reported it like the weather. "You'll ride on too, soon as your horse is sound." Emmett looked down at the boy a long moment. Then he crouched in the dust so his eyes were level with Eli's, which grown men did not generally bother to do, and said quietly, "Maybe, but not today." It was not much of an answer. It was the smallest true thing a man could offer and still call it an answer. But Eli Rourke had grown up in the wreckage of one enormous promise, and had watched 100 men pass through Cold Springs on their way to somewhere else. And there was something in the plainness of this small one he did not know how to hold. He looked at the stranger crouched level with him, offering nothing beyond sundown. "All right," Eli said. That was how it started. Not with the horse, though everyone at Cold Springs would say afterward it started with the horse. It started with a boy asking a stranger if he was leaving, and with a man who had spent 3 years walking away from everything he touched, now crouching in the dust of a stage yard and saying, for the first time in all that while, "Not today." Della Rourke had not advertised for a hired man, and would have sent one down the road if he'd applied. And both those facts sat easier on her than the one underneath them, which she told nobody, which was that she had lain awake most of the past year doing arithmetic in the dark, and the arithmetic came out the same every time. Short. She had come to Cold Springs a bride of 19, behind a husband who could sell sunshine. Tom Rourke had a laugh you could hear across a river, and a habit of describing the future until it sounded already paid for. He won the station contract at cards and a good deal of charm, and he ran it as he ran everything, generously and on credit, standing rounds for every driver on the line and telling Della not to fret over the ledger, that Cold Springs would be worth a fortune the day the railroad came through. The railroad never came. In the spring of 1884, the Sweetwater rose over the low crossing and took Tom's coach and Tom with it. The 4 passengers dragged out alive, and the driver not. And Della buried her husband and opened his account books in the same week, and understood, reading them by lamplight with 5-year-old Eli asleep in the next room, exactly what kind of fortune she had been left. It was not that Tom had meant them harm. He never meant a thing in his life but well. That was almost the worst of it. He had promised her the earth and half the sky besides, and he had believed every word as he said it. And then he had died and left her to be the one who paid for all that lovely believing. 3 years she had spent learning the true weight of a spoken future. She had settled it in herself, the way you settle a thing that has cost you, that she would trust her own 2 hands, and never again a future made of breath. And above all that, she would guard her boy from the one wound she knew by heart, which is the wound of a child who keeps watching a road for someone who will not come back up it. Which was why she watched the drifter with the lame bay so carefully those first days. Not because she feared him, because she saw her son trail after him around the yard, the way a foal trails its dam, and she knew exactly how that story ended for a boy. Emmett Shaw, for his part, had not meant to stay past the day his gelding was sound. He had not meant to do much of anything in 3 years. He had been a horse soldier once, and then a horse breaker, a man known up and down 2 territories for gentling what other men could only break. And he had had a wife named Ellen, with a laugh like water over stones, and a son named Danny, who at 6 could already sit a horse as though he'd been poured onto it. Emmett had been 3 weeks out on a horse-buying trip when the diphtheria came through their valley, and he had ridden the last 40 miles home in the dark the night the letter reached him. And he had come up his own lane at dawn to find the house quiet and 2 new graves under the cottonwood, dug by neighbors because there had been no one else to do it. He had not been there. That was the whole of it, the thing he carried, the thing no number of miles ever set down. A man whose trade was calming frightened creatures, off doing it for strangers while his own boy called his name, and he did not come. After that, he could not stay anywhere. Staying meant loving something, and loving something meant it could be taken while your back was turned. So Emmett Shaw kept his back turned to the whole world and called it safety, and drifted. And then, a boy on a stage yard rail had asked him if he was leaving, and answered for him before he could. "Everybody leaves. My pa's gone." And something 3 years frozen in Emmett had cracked clean down the middle. He stayed a week to rest the gelding, then another because the well pump had a broken sucker rod and no one else would fix it. At the end of that first week, the boy caught him at the tack room door in the dusk and asked it straight out, the floorboard test. "Are you leaving?" Emmett looked at the small, braced face and said, "Not today," and watched the boy weigh the 2 words and decide, provisionally, to trust them one more day. He stayed a 3rd week because the Tuesday stage limped in on a lame wheeler and he had it sound by Thursday, and by then it seemed foolish to pretend the reason he was staying had much to do with a horse of his own. Della offered him wages she could not afford, and he named a figure lower than she offered, which was the first thing about him that genuinely alarmed her. Because in her experience, a man who worked for less than his worth always meant to be paid in some other coin. She watched for it. It did not come. He did the work of 2 hostlers and ate less than 1 and slept in the tack room and touched his hat and called her Mrs. Rourke. And the only thing he seemed to want was to be left at the quiet edges of the day. What surprised her first was how he took her orders. The eastbound came through on a tight schedule that gave 11 minutes to swap a 6-horse team, and the first time Emmett worked a change with her, she braced for a man who would take it over. He did the opposite. He fell in beside her and did precisely what she called unbuckling on her word, leading in her order, letting her run her own yard as she'd run it 3 years. And when the coach rolled out on the 10th minute, he simply went back to the harness he'd been mending. It rattled her more than if he'd argued. She was used to men who wanted the reins. She had never met one content to hand them back. Emmett could not have told you the moment it turned for him, only that it was somewhere in those 11-minute changes. He had spent 3 years among strangers being careful to feel nothing. And here was a woman who ran a yard like a first sergeant and never once raised her voice, quick and sure and asking no man's help she hadn't decided to ask for. And he found he liked doing a thing well beside her more than he had liked anything in a long time. He caught himself watching for her step on the boards of a morning. He caught himself one night mending a split trace by lamplight while she worked the day's figures across the counter, glad of the quiet and the company and unwilling to be the one to break either, and understood, with something close to alarm, that he was no longer staying only for the boy. But it was the boy the whole yard could see. It began at the round pen in the last light. Eli was on the rail talking at Blue, and Blue was ignoring him with the whole commitment of his kind, and Emmett came by with a bucket and stopped and said, before he'd decided to, "You're asking him to come to you. He won't. A horse like that, you make it his idea. And you don't do it from in there," he added when the boy put a foot to the bottom rail. "Not yet. That horse has put grown men in the dirt. You'll learn him from this side of the fence until he tells me different." "How do you make it his idea?" "You go in alone, and you don't look at him, and you don't chase him, and you don't want a single thing off him," Emmett said. "You just stand where he can watch you not wanting anything. Takes a while. He's got to decide you're not one more man come to make him do something." He set the bucket down. Everybody who's gone at that horse has gone at him wanting. He can smell it. It's the wanting that scares him. So it was Emmett who went in those first mornings, alone, before the eastbound, while the boy sat the top rail and learned by watching, which is its own kind of patience and the hardest kind to ask of an 8-year-old. Blue did nothing the first 3 mornings but circle, keeping the man at the center of a wary orbit, and Emmett did nothing but stand half-turned with his eyes down and let him. On the 4th morning, Blue stopped circling and stood. On the 6th, he dropped his head. And on the 7th, Emmett looked up at the boy on the rail and said, quiet, "All right, slow. Come stand by me and want nothing." And Eli climbed down and crossed the pen one careful step at a time and stood at Emmett's shoulder, and the 2 of them waited together, wanting nothing, for 2 more mornings. On the 9th, in the gray before the eastbound, the blue roan walked the whole width of the pen and put his nose against the back of Eli Rourke's neck, and the boy stood absolutely still, with tears running down his face, and made no sound at all. And Emmett, a careful arm's reach away, had to study the mountains for a while. That evening, Eli asked him again. He asked it at the supper table this time, in front of his mother, quiet. "Are you leaving?" Emmett set down his cup and said, "Not today." The same 2 words as always, except that this time, saying them, his eyes went across the table to Della and stayed there a moment before they came back to the boy. Della looked down at her plate. She had heard a great many men say a great many things across that counter, and none of them had ever frightened her the way those 2 plain words did, said with his eyes on her. She had begun, without admitting it to herself, setting a second cup by the stove of a morning, poured and waiting for him when he came in off the early change. She did not know what to do with a man who wanted so little and gave so much. Let me step out of the story here for just a moment. I don't know where this finds you tonight. Maybe you're washing up after supper, or driving a dark road home, or sitting somewhere quiet while the light goes down. Wherever it is, I'm glad you pulled up a chair by this fire. If Della and Eli and that stubborn blue roan have earned a little of your evening, tapping that like button helps this quiet corner keep its lamp lit. And it would mean the world to me if you'd tell me, down in the comments, the name of the town you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, back to Cold Springs. Because Harlan Foss is about to drive up from town, and the man holds more of this station's future in his pocket than Della knows, Harlan Foss did not think himself a cruel man, which is a different thing from not being one. He held the freight contract for the district, and 2 winters back, he had gone quietly to the bank and bought up Tom Rourke's note, the whole of the paper on Cold Springs, the way a careful man buys up anything that might one day give him a seat at a table he wants. He had said nothing about it for 2 years. He was a widower, prosperous and correct, with a square brick house in town. And he had watched Della Rourke run that station into the black by main strength, and decided, in his methodical way, that a woman who could do that was a woman worth acquiring, and that the note in his safe was the surest road to it. He came up on a Sunday and put it to her over coffee, the boy sent out to the pen so he could speak to Della privately. He was sorry to raise it, he said, but the year's installment on the note had fallen due, and Cold Springs could not pay it in a lump, and they both knew it. He did not raise his voice or make a threat. He did not have to. The paper was in his safe, and the water was rising, and they both understood the shape of the thing. But there was a simpler road, he said, for a sensible woman. Marry him. The note became a husband's private affair, never mentioned again. The boy got a brick house and a schoolmaster and a future. Instead of a hard-scrabble stop, the railroad would close inside 5 years. "I won't insult you by calling it a love match," Foss said, turning the ledger on her counter so the red showed. "I'm offering you something steadier. You married a laugh once, Della, and look what it left you holding." He tapped the page. Marry an account that balances this time. It landed because it was the thing she had told herself 100 nights in the dark. She had married a laugh you could hear across a river, and it had left her a mountain of debt and a grave at the low crossing, and a boy who still watched the South Pass Road at sundown. Foss was the opposite of Tom. He was the sensible thing, and the sensible thing had a note in its safe, and she stood in her own kitchen with her hands knotting her apron and heard how easy it would be to say yes. She did not say yes. Nor did she say she'd think on it, which is what she'd said to every hard thing for 3 years. She surprised them both. "No, Mr. Foss, and once is all I mean to say it, so hear me now. You've been within your rights, and I'll not pretend otherwise. But I buried one marriage built on a future somebody else described for me, and I will not enter another one balanced on your ledger. I'll pay what's owed the way I've paid everything on this place, out of my own work, $1 at a time. Call the note if you have to. I'll manage that too, same as I've managed all of it." Foss studied her, a man unused to a first-time no. He did not forgive the note. He was not that kind of man, and she had not asked him to be. He gathered his hat and said coolly that the overdue installment would need to be paid inside 3 months, or he'd have no choice but to move on the whole of the paper. That it was business and nothing personal, and that he'd be sorry to see a good station go under out of a widow's pride. Then he drove back to town, and the debt sat on Cold Springs exactly where it had sat before. And Della Rourke went out to bring her boy in from the pen, with her back straight and her 3 months already spending themselves, and no notion on God's earth where the money would come from. The accident came 4 days later, fast and out of a clear sky, the way they always come at a stage stop. The noon coach rolled in hot off the pass behind a green driver and a 6 that had been spooked by a rattlesnake a mile back and had not gotten over it. Della was already moving for the coach as it slewed to a stop, catching the lines the driver had half dropped and throwing her weight on the brake lever, because a loaded coach that rolls is worse than any loose team, and she had run this yard 3 years and knew where the danger was. Which left the plunging near leader to Emmett, who was at the horses' heads, and that would have been fine, entirely fine, except that Eli saw his mother's wash on the line square in the path of that lead horse and darted in to save it. A boy of 8 will always save the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. He went down in the dirt not 3 feet from the near leader's striking 4 feet. The whole 6 lunged in the traces. Della had the brake and the lines, and the coach held fast, and the boy was under no wheel, but he was down at the feet of a terrified half-ton horse that was rearing to come down. And for one long freezing instant, Emmett Shaw saw it, and it was not 1887 anymore, and it was not Wyoming. It was every dark road he had ridden too late. This time, he was near enough. He did not try to wrestle the team. No man alive can wrestle a 6. He did the one thing 3 years of gentling frightened animals had put in his hands. He got a fist in the near leader's cheek strap and threw his whole weight down and to the side, hauling that one horse's nose hard around toward its own shoulder. A horse cannot strike down where its head is cranked away. Under the squeal and stamp, he kept talking, the same flat, unhurried voice he used in the pen. "Easy now, easy, whoa." Not because this horse knew that voice, but because panic recognizes panic, and Emmett gave it none. The near leader felt that one still thing in the middle of the storm and checked for half a heartbeat, its 4 feet still in the air. And half a heartbeat was all Emmett needed. He reached down with his free hand into the space he had just bought and dragged the boy out from under the horse by the back of his shirt and rolled with him clear, and the forefeet came down into the dirt where the child had been. When it was over, the six stood blowing and trembling, Della still on the brake, the coach held. Emmett sat in the dust with the boy against his chest, his own left hand laid open where a hoof had grazed it, and his shoulder wrenched and screaming, and he felt neither one. Eli was crying and scraped raw down one arm, but whole, alive. And Emmett shook like a man in a fever because he had come this time. He had been near enough, and he had come. And across the yard, still gripping the brake with her knuckles white, Della Rourke understood two things at once: that her boy was safe, and that the two of them, she and the drifter, had just held one terrible half-minute together, and neither had failed the other. He told her that night on the porch, after the boy was finally asleep, and his hand was bound and his shoulder set. He had not meant to. He was a man who'd gone 3 years telling no one anything. But she came out with 2 cups of coffee gone half cold and sat beside him on the step and said nothing at all, which is the only thing that has ever gotten a word out of a man like Emmett Shaw. And after a long while, watching the dark shape of the mountains, he told her about Ellen and about Danny. He told her about the 2 graves under the cottonwood, dug by other men because he'd been off gentling horses for strangers. "I wasn't there," he said. It was the whole confession, 3 years of it, in 3 words. "He was 6. He called for me, they told me, and I was 300 miles off doing this exact thing." He turned his bound hand over in the lamplight. "I told myself I'd never be near enough to fail anybody like that again. Keep moving. Don't stay anywhere long enough to have something worth losing." He was quiet a moment. "Your boy asked me, that first day, if I was leaving, and I couldn't answer him yes. 3 years I've left every place I ever set my boot, and I couldn't leave a stage stop and a boy who isn't even mine." Della sat with it a long time. The night wind came down off the pass, smelling of sage and far snow. "Tom promised us the earth," she said at last. "A house with glass windows, a cook stove from Cheyenne. He promised that boy a horse of his own, did you know? Last thing he ever told him. 'I'll catch you a horse of your own, son. Wait and see.' And then the river took him, and I've spent 3 years teaching my child that a man's promises are only weather. They blow through, and they're gone." She looked at him. "And here you sit. Won't promise me a thing past sundown. Not today, again and again, like it's all you've got. It's the only word anybody's kept to that boy in 3 years." "It's the only one I know how to keep," Emmett said. "I can promise you today. I can promise I'll be here in the morning. I can't promise I'll never be afraid, because I will be, every day. That's the cost of the thing. But I'm done keeping my back turned, Della. I turned around in that yard today, and I'm not going back to what I was." "Then don't promise me forever," Della said, and her voice was not quite steady. "It's the ones who promise you forever that leave. Promise me the morning, and then get up and promise me the morning again. I think that's the only honest way anybody ever stays." "One morning at a time," Emmett said. "One morning at a time," she agreed. His shoulder was slow to mend. For the better part of a month he worked the yard one-armed, and Della, who had not in 3 years let another soul near her ledger, kept his figures for him and held the gate on the changes without being asked. And neither of them remarked on what it meant that she did. The money they made themselves in the end, because that was the only way either of them would have trusted it. Word of the drifter who'd turned a bolting 6 by the head and gentled the outlaw blue roan went down the Sweetwater line the way such things do. Inside a fortnight, the division agent who had once told Della to sell Blue for tannery money was offering Emmett Shaw a contract. He would work the ruined ones out of the company's own remount string, the biters and the bolters and the arguments with legs that other men had given up on. There was a fixed monthly retainer to keep him on the line and a fee for every head he turned out sound. He worked them in Della's round pen, and Blue looked on from the adjoining pen over the rail, gentled all the way down now, a living argument that the thing could be done. It was not a fortune, and it did not pay off the whole of Tom's paper, which would take them years yet, $1 and a season at a time. But by the day Foss's 3 months ran out, it had paid the overdue installment in full and brought the note current, and Foss took the money with a cold nod and the remark that she'd bought herself another year, which, from a man like Foss, was neither blessing nor threat. Only a ledger closing on one line and opening on the next. It was enough. 1 year kept safe by their own work was worth more to Della Rourke than any brick house handed over for a name on a marriage line. Emmett proposed at the round pen because it was the only place it could have happened. It was a Sunday evening in the fall, Blue standing loose with his head over Eli's shoulder, and Emmett said it plainly because plain was all he knew. "It's your place," he said. "Your name over the door, your ledger, your boy. I've no fortune to promise, and no house with glass windows. All I've got is this. I'll get up every morning I'm given, and I'll be here. And I'll love the both of you, one morning at a time, for as many mornings as I'm allowed." He paused. "That's the whole of the offer. It isn't much." "It's the only offer anybody ever made me that was true," Della said. Over at the pen, Eli had gone very still, the way he did when he was testing whether a floorboard would hold him. But this time, he did not ask the old, braced question. This time, for the first time in 3 years, he dared the other one. "Are you staying?" the boy asked. Emmett walked to the pen and crouched in the dust, so his eyes were level with Eli's, the way he had the very first day. "I'm staying," he said. "Not maybe, not today. I'm staying, Eli. I finally learned how." The boy put out his hand, and Emmett took it, and the blue roan lowered his head over the both of them, and none of the three, for once, was watching the South Pass Road. They married that next spring in the town church, quietly, the drivers of the Sweetwater line taking up 2 whole pews and standing rounds afterward the way Tom would have liked. Cold Springs stayed Della's to run, and she ran it, and the difference now was only that the man mending harness in the yard answered to her call on the 11-minute change, and slept in the house instead of the tack room, and had stopped, somewhere along the way, being a drifter at all. Blue became Eli's own horse that summer, the promise kept at last, though by another man's hand than the one who'd made it. And the boy rode him up the ridge on clear evenings and grew steady and unafraid, the way children do once they have finally stopped watching a road. And in the hired hand register at Cold Springs, the long ledger where every driver, hostler, and stray hand who ever worked the line had signed his name in one column and written sooner or later the date he drew his pay and rode on in the next, there was one line where the second column stayed empty. Emmett Shaw, the first column read, in a square, plain hand. And beside it, where every other man on every page before him had eventually written the day he left, there was nothing, and there never would be. You know what stays with me about this one? Emmett Shaw spent 3 years believing the way to keep from losing something was to never have it. Keep your back turned, keep moving, never be near enough to fail anyone, and call that safety. And it was really just a slower way of losing everything, one empty mile at a time. A fatherless boy on a stage yard rail turned him around with the simplest question there is. The question was never, "Are you staying forever?" Nobody can promise forever, and the ones who swear it loudest are usually the first ones gone. It was only ever this: "Are you here? Are you near enough? Will you get up tomorrow and be near enough again?" Because that is the whole of it. Love isn't the grand promise, the house with glass windows, the fortune when the railroad comes. Those blow through like weather. Love is the small thing kept in the morning and kept again the next morning. The not today that turns, if you keep saying it, into all the mornings there are. It's a man crouching in the dust to be level with a frightened child. It's staying near enough to fail and coming anyway. Thank you, truly, for spending this evening with me. Until the next trail, friend, leave the porch light on.